The sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden glow over the quiet city streets. The air was crisp, and shopkeepers were rolling up their shutters, preparing for another ordinary day. People rushed to work, cars honked in the distance, and everything seemed normal, until flashing blue and red lights shattered the calm. A group of police officers stormed into a small coffee shop, their voices firm, their movements quick. The customers froze as they watched the scene unfold before them. Standing near the counter was a well-dressed man, sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper. He seemed completely unaware of what was about to happen. One of the officers pointed at him. "That's him. Cuff him." Before he could react, strong hands grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back. The sound of metal clicking sent a shiver down his spine. "Sir, you're under arrest," one of the officers said in a stern voice. Confusion spread across the man's face. He looked around at the stunned faces of the people in the cafe. "There must be some mistake," he said, trying to remain calm. "What am I being arrested for?" But the officers didn't answer. Instead, they tightened their grip and led him outside to the waiting police cars. The crowd inside whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. As the man was shoved into the back of the police car, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had done nothing wrong. Why was this happening? Who would frame him? The officers drove in silence, their faces unreadable. The man tried to speak again, but every time he asked a question, they ignored him. The car weaved through the busy city, passing familiar streets, places he had walked freely just hours ago. Now, he was trapped, helpless, and accused of something he didn't even know about. After what felt like an eternity, the car finally pulled up in front of the police station. The doors opened, and he was yanked out. His expensive suit was now wrinkled, his neatly combed hair slightly disheveled. Officers walked him through the long, cold corridors of the station, past desks where other officers worked on paperwork, past holding cells filled with people who looked as confused as he felt. They took him to a small interrogation room, where a single chair sat across from a metal table. A dim light flickered above, casting a shadow over his tired face. He sat down, exhaling sharply, trying to process everything. Minutes passed. Then hours. The door remained closed. His mind raced. Had someone stolen his identity? Had he unknowingly been involved in something illegal? Nothing made sense. Finally, the door creaked open, and a detective walked in, holding a thick file. He placed it on the table and sat across from him, his eyes cold and serious. "Do you know why you're here?" the detective asked. The man shook his head. "No. I don't." The detective slid the file toward him and opened it. Inside were pictures, documents, and something that made the man's stomach drop, a blurry surveillance photo. It was him. Or at least, it looked like him. "This is you, correct?" the detective asked. The man stared at the image, his pulse quickening. The figure in the picture did look like him, same suit, same build, even a similar face. But he knew without a doubt that this wasn't him. "No," he said firmly. "That's not me." The detective narrowed his eyes. "The evidence says otherwise. You were seen near the crime scene. Witnesses described you perfectly. Your fingerprints were found." The man's mouth went dry. How could this be possible? He had been at home last night, watching the news, reading his emails, living his normal life. There was no way he could have been at any crime scene. "There's been a mistake," he said. "I wasn't there. I don't know what you're talking about." The detective leaned back in his chair, studying him. "People always say that. But the truth always comes out." The door opened again, and another officer walked in, whispering something to the detective. The detective nodded and stood up. "We'll be back," he said before stepping out. The man sat alone once again, his hands still cuffed. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something bigger. Someone wanted him to take the fall for something he hadn't done. But who? And why? Little did he know, the truth about his arrest would shock not only him, but the entire police department. The cold metal of the handcuffs pressed against his wrists as he sat in the dimly lit interrogation room. The silence was suffocating. He had been sitting there for what felt like hours, waiting for someone to explain why he had been arrested. His mind raced with questions. How could this be happening? He had lived a quiet, honest life. He had a stable job, a good reputation. There was no reason for the police to suspect him of anything. The door creaked open again, and the detective returned, holding another file. He placed it on the table, his expression unreadable. "We ran your background check," the detective said, flipping through the papers. "You have no criminal record. No history of violence. You've never even had a parking ticket." The man exhaled sharply. "Exactly. That's why I keep telling you, this is a mistake. I didn't do anything." The detective tapped the file. "That's the problem," he said. "Your record is too clean." The man frowned. "What do you mean?" The detective leaned forward. "We checked all databases. No financial issues, no prior police interactions, nothing. It's like you've lived a perfectly scripted life." He paused. "And that's suspicious." The man stared at him in disbelief. "Suspicious? So now I'm a suspect because I haven't done anything wrong?" Before the detective could answer, the door opened again, and another officer entered, carrying a small plastic bag. Inside was a wallet, a phone, and a set of keys, the man's belongings, taken when he was arrested. The officer handed the bag to the detective. "We went through his phone. Something's off." The detective pulled out the phone and placed it on the table. "Your call logs are empty," he said. "No outgoing calls, no texts. Not even social media activity. For someone in your position, that's unusual." The man's stomach tightened. "I don't use my phone much," he admitted. "I prefer keeping things private." The detective didn't look convinced. "Or maybe," he said, "you don't want anyone tracing your conversations." The man sighed in frustration. "This is ridiculous. I have nothing to hide. You have the wrong person." The detective studied him for a long moment before closing the file. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe you're not who you say you are." The man felt a chill run down his spine. "Who you say you are?" The words lingered in the air, heavy with suspicion. The detective stood up. "We're running some additional checks," he said. "Fingerprint analysis, facial recognition. If there's anything we need to know about you, we'll find it." With that, he walked out, leaving the man alone once again. A shocking discovery. Meanwhile, in another room of the police station, officers were busy analyzing the fingerprints they had taken from him earlier. One officer stared at the computer screen, frowning. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. Another officer walked over. "What is it?" The first officer pointed at the screen. "His fingerprints don't match any existing records. It's like he doesn't exist." The second officer narrowed his eyes. "That's impossible. Everyone has a record somewhere, birth certificates, passports, driver's licenses." "Run it again." The officer did, but the results came back the same. No match. Confused, they decided to run a facial recognition search through government databases. As the system processed the data, an alert suddenly flashed on the screen. "Match found." The officers leaned in, expecting to see his real identity. But what they found instead left them speechless. The screen displayed an old classified file, one that had been sealed for years. The image on the screen was blurry, but there was no doubt about it. It was him. But the name listed wasn't the one he had given them. And the details didn't add up. "What the hell?" one of the officers whispered. The file was marked confidential with a government seal. There were notes indicating he had been part of a top-secret case, something involving federal agencies. But the rest of the details were heavily redacted. One thing was clear. This man was not just an ordinary citizen. Back in the interrogation room, the man sat quietly, staring at the floor, lost in thought. He was tired, hungry, and frustrated beyond words. The door burst open, and the detective rushed in, holding a printout of the classified file. His face had changed, no longer just suspicious, but almost worried. He slapped the paper onto the table. "Explain this." The man looked down at the paper. As soon as he saw the blurred image of himself and the confidential stamp, his expression darkened. He closed his eyes briefly and exhaled. He had been trying to live a normal life, to escape from his past. But now, it had caught up with him. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "That's what we should be asking you," the detective said, his voice sharp. "Who are you really? And why is your file classified?" The man looked up, meeting the detective's eyes. He knew he had only two options: keep pretending or tell the truth. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. A thick silence filled the interrogation room. The man stared at the classified file in front of him. His fingers twitched slightly as he traced the edges of the paper. He had spent years trying to bury his past, to live a quiet, untraceable life. But now, with the police staring at him like a puzzle they couldn't solve, he realized, his past had found him. The detective leaned in, his eyes sharp. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Who are you?" The man exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I'm exactly who I told you I am," he said. "A regular guy, living a normal life." The detective slammed his fist on the table, making the metal vibrate. "Cut the act," he snapped. "This file says otherwise. Government seals. Redacted information. No records in public databases. That's not a normal life." The man remained silent, his jaw tight. The detective picked up the printout of the classified file and waved it in front of him. "You know what I think? I think you've been running from something. Or someone. And you've done a damn good job at hiding, until now." The man's gaze remained steady, but deep inside, he felt a familiar unease creeping in. The detective wasn't wrong. He had been running. Not from the police. Not from criminals. But from a past that could destroy him. The unfinished puzzle. Meanwhile, in another part of the station, two officers sat in front of the computer, reviewing the classified file. "This doesn't make sense," one of them murmured, scrolling through the limited information. "If this guy was a criminal, there would be a full case file. Arrest records. A trial. Something." The other officer frowned. "But there's nothing. No known aliases. No fingerprints in any database. Only this half-sealed government file with heavy redactions." He leaned back in his chair. "If he was dangerous, we would have been warned about him. But instead, it's like someone wanted to erase him." The first officer glanced at the photo again. "And yet, here he is." They exchanged a look. Whatever they had stumbled upon, it was bigger than a simple mistaken arrest. Someone out there knew exactly who this man was. And they didn't want anyone else to find out. Pressure mounts. Back in the interrogation room, the detective paced the floor. His frustration was evident. He was used to breaking people, getting them to confess. But this man was different. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't pleading innocence. He was simply waiting. For what? The detective suddenly stopped pacing. "You're not worried," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Most people in your position would be panicking right now, demanding a lawyer, shouting that they're innocent. But you? You're just sitting there. Like you're waiting for something to happen." The man didn't respond. The detective's gut told him this wasn't just another case. Something bigger was in motion. And then a phone rang. Not in the interrogation room. Not from the man's confiscated belongings. It was coming from outside, at the main desk. One of the officers picked it up. "City Police Department, how can I help you?" A deep, authoritative voice responded. "This is Special Agent Carter from the Federal Bureau. You have someone in custody, a man brought in earlier today. You need to release him. Immediately." The officer's eyes widened. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," the agent said. "Release him. Now." The officer hesitated. "Sir, we have reason to believe this man is hiding something." "He's not your problem," the agent interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of warning. "I suggest you cooperate. If not, you'll be receiving a call from someone much higher up." And with that, the line went dead. The call that changed everything. The officer, now visibly shaken, rushed to the interrogation room, whispering something into the detective's ear. The detective's expression darkened. He glanced at the man, who still sat calmly, as if he already knew what was happening. The detective turned back to the officer. "Who was it?" "Feds," the officer said. "They want us to release him." The detective's grip tightened around the case file. "Just like that?" "Just like that." The detective looked at the man again, his mind racing. This wasn't normal. The FBI didn't just intervene in routine arrests, especially not for an unknown man with a redacted file. Who was he? And more importantly, why did the government want him out so badly? The moment of truth. Without another word, the detective unlocked the handcuffs. The man stood up, rolling his wrists as if this was all just an inconvenience. "Guess this means I'm free to go?" he asked, his voice steady. The detective clenched his jaw. He wasn't happy about this. Something wasn't right, and he knew it. "Not so fast," he said, blocking the door. "I don't care who called. I still have questions. If you're not guilty, why were you arrested in the first place?" The man sighed. He couldn't explain, not fully. Because if he did, the detective's life would change forever. So instead, he gave a small, almost knowing smile. "Let's just say, some things are better left unknown." And with that, he stepped out of the room. A vanishing act. As the officers watched him leave, unease settled over the station. The detective knew this wasn't the end. Something much bigger was happening, something they weren't supposed to understand. One of the officers ran back to the database, trying to pull up the classified file again. But when he clicked the link, error, file not found. The entire record had been wiped clean. Like he had never existed at all. The police station was unusually silent after the man left. Officers exchanged uncertain glances, their unease thick in the air. The classified file, the only piece of evidence linking him to anything, was gone. Erased. As if it had never existed. Detective Harris, still gripping his coffee cup, stared at the blank screen where the man's file had been just minutes ago. He refused to believe what had just happened. The FBI doesn't make urgent calls for just anyone. Who was that man? And why did the government want him out so badly? A search with no answers. Determined to get some answers, Harris called his best IT expert, Officer Riley. "Pull up the security footage from the past 24 hours, Harris ordered. "I need to know exactly when that file was deleted and by who." Riley got to work, his fingers flying across the keyboard. A few minutes later, he frowned. This doesn't make sense. What? The footage, it's all here. No signs of a hack. But the file? It was wiped remotely at the exact moment the man walked out of this station. Harris's pulse quickened. That's impossible, he muttered. But Riley wasn't done. And there's something else, he added. I tried running his mugshot through facial recognition. You're not going to believe this. Harris leaned in. Try me. Riley turned the screen toward him. There are no matches. Not in any system. It's like, the guy doesn't exist. The vanishing act. The words sent a chill through Harris. No matches? No records? The man had been standing in their station just an hour ago, and now, it was like he had never been there at all. Harris pushed away from the desk, running a hand through his hair. This isn't over, he muttered. A mysterious trail. With nothing left in their system, Harris turned to the only other thing he could rely on, witness accounts. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, heading to the nearest convenience store where the man had been picked up. The store owner, an older woman with sharp eyes, stood behind the counter. When Harris showed her the man's picture, she immediately stiffened. I remember him, she said, lowering her voice. What do you know? Harris pressed. She hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone was listening. Then, she leaned forward. He wasn't just any man, she whispered. I've seen him before. Years ago. Harris frowned. What do you mean? She pulled out an old newspaper from beneath the counter, her hands slightly trembling. It was dated 15 years ago. Right there, on the front page, was a grainy black and white photo of the same man. The headline sent a shiver down Harris's spine. Hero agent killed in top-secret operation. Harris's blood ran cold. This can't be right. Dead. Yet alive. But that's not possible, Harris said. If he was declared dead years ago, how was he arrested here today? The store owner's expression darkened. That's what they wanted people to believe. Harris studied the article. The man's name wasn't printed, only that he was a high-ranking federal agent who had died under mysterious circumstances. The details of his death? Classified. Harris flipped through the rest of the newspaper. What happened after this? No one knows, the woman said. There were whispers about a cover-up, but the story disappeared. Just like he did. Harris inhaled deeply. Was that why the FBI wanted him out so quickly? Because he was supposed to be dead? A dangerous realization. Harris left the store, his mind racing. He knew he was getting close to something he wasn't supposed to know. The FBI had erased his records. The man's past had been buried. And yet, he was here. Alive. As Harris got into his car, his phone rang. A blocked number. He hesitated, then answered. A deep voice spoke on the other end. Detective Harris, drop the case. Harris's grip tightened on the wheel. Who is this? The voice ignored his question. Stop looking for him. Forget you ever saw him. This isn't your fight. Click. The line went dead. Harris's heart pounded. This was bigger than anything he had ever dealt with before. And now, he was being watched. The chase begins. Harris knew one thing for certain, he couldn't drop this case. He needed to find the man. Before someone else did. Detective Harris sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind raced through everything that had happened so far. A man with no identity. A classified file that had been wiped. A mysterious phone call warning him to stop digging. It was all too much. But Harris wasn't the type to walk away. He had spent years uncovering the truth in the toughest cases, and something told him this was bigger than he could imagine. Who was this man? Why was the FBI so desperate to make him disappear? And most importantly, why was he supposedly dead? A secret meeting. Harris needed answers. There was only one person who might be able to help, his old friend, Daniel, a former FBI agent who had retired under suspicious circumstances. Harris dialed his number. It rang twice before Daniel picked up. "You shouldn't be calling me, Harris," he said immediately. His voice was calm but carried a hint of warning. "I need answers," Harris said. "And I think you know what I'm talking about." Silence. Then, Daniel sighed. "Meet me at the old parking lot near 9th Street. Midnight. And come alone." The call ended. A dangerous road. That night, Harris drove to the abandoned parking lot. It was cold, and the streets were empty. The kind of quiet that made him uneasy. Daniel stood near a broken streetlight, wearing a dark coat. He looked around nervously as Harris approached. "You're walking into something you can't control," Daniel said. "This isn't just some missing person case. This is about power." Harris crossed his arms. "Then tell me what I'm dealing with." Daniel hesitated, then pulled out a small USB drive from his pocket. "This is all I could find," he said. "It's a Black Ops file. A project that never officially existed. They called it Phantom." Harris took the USB and inserted it into his laptop. A few grainy black and white images popped up. One of them showed the same man who had been arrested. But the date on the file? It was from 15 years ago. The Phantom Agent. Daniel exhaled slowly. He was an elite operative, working deep undercover. His missions were so classified that even most of the government didn't know they existed. Harris scrolled through the file. Missions. Operations. Disappearances. Then, his eyes landed on a chilling phrase. Status, terminated. Harris looked up. They marked him as dead. Daniel nodded. Because he knew too much. He was part of something they didn't want getting out. "But he's alive," Harris said. Daniel's face darkened. "Which means someone failed. And now they're trying to fix that mistake. A race against time." Harris felt his chest tighten. If what Daniel said was true, then the man he had arrested wasn't just some random guy. He was a ghost, someone the world wasn't supposed to see again. And if the FBI wanted him gone, that meant he was running from something even bigger. Harris shut the laptop. "I need to find him," he said. Daniel shook his head. "If you do, you might not come back." But Harris had already made up his mind. The hunt begins. Back at his apartment, Harris plugged the USB into a secure system and traced the last known location of the man before his arrest. A motel on the outskirts of town. Without wasting time, Harris grabbed his gun, badge, and keys. As he stepped outside, his phone rang again. Blocked number. He hesitated before answering. A cold, robotic voice spoke this time. "This is your last warning, detective. Stop looking. Or you'll disappear just like him." The call cut off. Harris stood frozen for a moment. Then, he got into his car. There was no turning back now. Detective Harris gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove through the empty streets. His mind was racing. He had spent years dealing with tough cases, but nothing like this. A man erased from existence. A secret government project. And now, someone was watching his every move. The threatening phone call from earlier still echoed in his ears. "This is your last warning, detective. Stop looking. Or you'll disappear just like him." But Harris had no intention of stopping. If anything, he was more determined than ever. A motel on the edge of town. The address from the classified file led him to a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. It looked abandoned, the neon sign flickering weakly. Harris parked his car at a distance and approached cautiously. His instincts told him someone had been here recently. The door to room 14 was slightly open. Hand resting on his gun, Harris pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with scattered papers on the table. A chair had been knocked over. Someone had left in a hurry. Then he saw it. A half-eaten meal on the table. Whoever had been here was just here. Harris scanned the room quickly, looking for clues. Then, under a pile of old newspapers, he found a small notebook. The cover was worn out, and the pages were filled with handwritten notes. A cry for help. As Harris flipped through the pages, his breath caught. The man had been tracking something. The notes were written in rushed, almost desperate handwriting. Dates. Places. Names. But one sentence, scribbled over and over, sent chills down Harris's spine. "They are coming for me." Harris clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about an innocent man being framed. This man knew something, something dangerous. And now, Harris was getting closer to it. A sudden attack. Just as Harris slipped the notebook into his pocket, he heard a noise outside. A car. He quickly moved to the window and peeked through the blinds. Two black SUVs had pulled up outside. The same type of SUVs he had seen government agents use. Harris's heart pounded. They were already here. He had to move fast. He grabbed the notebook, pulled his gun from his holster, and silently crept toward the back door. As he reached for the doorknob, bang! The front door slammed open, and armed men in black tactical gear stormed in. Harris barely had time to react. He dived behind the bed as bullets ripped through the walls. These weren't just ordinary cops. They were here to kill. A desperate escape. Harris's mind worked fast. He was outnumbered, but he still had a chance. He pulled a flashbang grenade from his belt, a last resort. He counted to 3, then threw it toward the door. Boom! A bright flash filled the room as the explosion stunned the gunman. Harris took his chance. He sprinted out the back door, ducking as more bullets whizzed past him. The cold night air hit his face as he ran toward his car. But as soon as he reached it, another SUV cut him off. More men jumped out, weapons raised. Harris had nowhere to run. A mysterious savior. Just when Harris thought it was over, a loud engine roared from behind. Another black car sped into the parking lot. The driver's door swung open, and a familiar voice yelled out, "Get in!" Harris didn't hesitate. He jumped into the car as bullets shattered the windshield. The driver slammed the gas, tires screeching as they sped away. As Harris turned to look at his rescuer, his eyes widened in shock. It was him. The man he had arrested. Who is he really? The man kept his eyes on the road, driving fast to shake off their pursuers. Harris struggled to process everything. "I thought you were in jail," Harris said, still catching his breath. The man smirked. "They wanted me there. But I don't go down that easy." Harris pulled out the notebook he had taken from the motel room. "You wrote this?" he asked. The man glanced at it and nodded. "That notebook has everything," he said. "Everything they don't want the world to know." Harris frowned. "Who are you?" The man's jaw tightened. "I was one of them," he admitted. "Until I found out the truth." Harris narrowed his eyes. "What truth?" The man sighed. "That the people you trust the most are the ones you should fear the most." Harris felt a chill run down his spine. This was just the beginning. The car sped through the dark streets, tires screeching as the man skillfully navigated sharp turns. The city lights blurred past, but neither he nor Detective Harris paid them any attention. The sound of gunfire had faded behind them, but Harris knew they weren't safe yet. His heart was still pounding from what had just happened. "Who are those men?" Harris demanded, still gripping the seatbelt tightly. The man kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched. "The same people who erased me." Harris didn't understand. "What does that mean?" The man sighed heavily. "I used to work for them." Harris raised an eyebrow. "Them?" The man glanced at him before focusing back on the road. "The government. But not the part you know. The part that operates in the shadows. A dark secret." Harris remained silent for a moment, trying to absorb what he was hearing. He had suspected this case was bigger than a simple wrongful arrest, but this was on a whole different level. "So you were an agent?" The man gave a small nod. "Something like that. I worked for a classified division, handling information that never sees the light of day." Harris exhaled sharply. "And now they want you dead." The man gave a humorless chuckle. "Let's just say I learned too much. I found out things they didn't want anyone to know." Harris stared at him. "Like what?" The man hesitated. Then, he took a deep breath. "Like the fact that our government has been keeping secrets, not just from the public, but from its own people. Illegal operations. People who disappear without a trace. And worse, experiments." Harris felt his stomach tighten. Experiments? The files that could change everything. The man pulled the car onto a hidden road and parked. He turned to Harris, his face serious. "There's something I need to show you." He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a USB drive. "Everything you need to know is on this." Harris hesitated before taking it. "What's on it?" he asked. The man's expression darkened. "Proof." Harris felt a chill run down his spine. He had been a detective for years, but he had never dealt with anything like this. Still, he had a duty to uncover the truth. He plugged the USB into his laptop, his hands slightly trembling. As the files loaded, his eyes widened in shock. There were hundreds of documents. Photos. Videos. Reports. Harris clicked on the first video. It showed a dimly lit underground facility. People in white lab coats walked through cold, sterile hallways. In one room, a man sat in a chair, restrained, his eyes filled with terror. Harris watched in horror as the scientists injected something into his arm. Moments later, the man began to convulse violently. The video ended abruptly. Harris closed the laptop and swallowed hard. "What the hell is this?" The man's voice was quiet but firm. "This is what they do to people who know too much. They don't just kill them. They use them. A race against time." Harris ran a hand through his hair. If this information got out, it would shake the entire country. But that also meant one thing. The people behind this would do anything to keep it secret. Harris took a deep breath. "We need to get this to the media." The man shook his head. "They control the media. This needs to go to someone they can't touch." Harris thought for a moment. Then, an idea came to him. There was one person he could trust. A retired journalist, someone who had spent his life uncovering corruption. But before Harris could say anything, the sound of approaching helicopters made them freeze. Nowhere left to run. The man cursed under his breath. "They found us." Harris looked out the window. In the distance, black SUVs were speeding toward them. There were too many. They had nowhere left to run. The man looked at Harris, his eyes determined. "We have to split up." Harris shook his head. Are you insane? You won't make it alone. The man smirked. I always do. Before Harris could argue, the man grabbed a burner phone from the dashboard and tossed it to him. Go to the address I text you. If I don't make it, you keep going. The truth has to come out. Harris hesitated. He didn't want to leave him behind. But they were running out of time. The helicopters were getting closer. The man reached for the door handle. See you on the other side, detective. And with that, he was gone. Harris clenched his jaw, then turned the key in the ignition. He floored the gas, speeding off in the opposite direction. As he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the helicopters circling where the man had disappeared. Harris only had one thought in his mind. He had to survive long enough to expose the truth. Detective Harris gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped through the darkened streets. His heart pounded in his chest. The USB drive sat on the seat beside him, holding secrets that could shake the entire country. But right now, there was only one question on his mind. Had the man escaped? He wanted to turn back, to help him fight off the men hunting him. But that wasn't an option. Not yet. He had a job to do. A desperate escape. The burner phone in his pocket buzzed. Harris grabbed it quickly, keeping one hand on the wheel. A message flashed on the screen. Head to the old train yard. Stay low. Don't trust anyone. Harris tightened his grip. The train yard, of course. It was abandoned years ago. The perfect place to hide. But before he could get there, the road ahead lit up with flashing red and blue lights. A police blockade. Harris slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the asphalt. He knew what this meant. They were onto him. Slowly, he reached for his badge, rolling down the window as an officer approached. Detective Harris, the officer said, his expression unreadable. Harris nodded. What's this about? The officer's gaze flickered toward the passenger seat, toward the USB drive. And that's when Harris knew. They weren't here to help. He acted fast. Before the officer could react, Harris threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as he spun the wheel. Gunshots rang out. Bullets shattered the windshield as he floored the gas, dodging between police cars. He had to get to the train yard. Reunion in the shadows. By the time Harris reached the old train yard, his hands were shaking. He parked deep inside the lot, hidden between rusting train cars. Silence. No helicopters. No flashing lights. He wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a bad one. Then, a shadow moved between the train cars. Harris reached for his gun, until he heard a familiar voice. You made it. The man stepped into the moonlight, his clothes torn, a cut on his forehead. But he was alive. Harris let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. They know, Harris said, holding up the USB drive. We have to move now. The man nodded. There's one last thing we need to do. Harris frowned. What? The man looked him dead in the eye. We need to take this straight to the people. The truth goes public. They didn't go to the media. They didn't trust the police. Instead, they went live. Using an encrypted broadcast, they streamed the files directly onto the internet. Social media, news forums, everywhere. To everyone watching this, you've been lied to. The man's voice was steady as he exposed the dark secrets buried for years. Harris watched the comments pour in. Thousands of people were watching. Then millions. It was working. And then the power cut out. The screen went black. The final confrontation. Floodlights blazed through the train yard. The sound of engines rumbled all around them. They were surrounded. Black SUVs. Helicopters overhead. Dozens of armed men stepping out with guns drawn. A voice echoed through a speaker. "You've done enough. Hand it over." Harris looked at the man. They both knew, this was it. They could run. They could fight. But the truth was already out. The world had seen it. The man raised his hands. "It's over." Harris did the same. They had won. As the officers moved in, pinning them to the ground, Harris caught sight of a phone screen on the pavement. The live stream was still rolling. The truth was out there now. And no one could stop it. Epilogue, the aftermath. Days passed. The video spread like wildfire. Investigations were launched. Protests erupted. The people demanded justice. And though Harris sat behind bars, he knew. They had done the right thing. The world would never be the same. And neither would he.